Please subscribe and share for more story. The first thing to return was sound. Not light. Not movement.
Sound.
A woman's voice cut through the fog that wrapped tightly around Margaret Hale, a 65-year-old widow lying motionless in an intensive care bed. "It's finished," the voice whispered. "The accounts are cleared. This is better for everyone." Margaret's body refused to respond. Her chest burned as if each breath had to crawl through fire. Her fingers lay useless against the white sheets. But her mind was awake, terrifyingly awake. She recognized the voice instantly. It belonged to her daughter, Vanessa Hale, 41, the child she had raised alone after her husband walked out decades earlier. Margaret sensed movement beside the bed, felt the air change as Vanessa leaned closer. A shadow fell across her face like a curtain being drawn. Then came the faintest pressure against the oxygen tubing at her throat. Not forceful. Not yet. Just enough to test. Margaret had given her entire life to that girl. Years of sacrifice. Endless forgiveness. And now, in the quiet of a hospital room, her reward was silence, and a hand deciding whether she deserved another breath. Vanessa believed her mother was lost to sedation. She spoke without caution, her tone bored, almost irritated.
"It's done," she said again.
3 transfers. All clean. She won't even know. Margaret's eyes fluttered open just a fraction. Enough to see the outline of her daughter at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, jaw tight, impatience written across her face. There was no grief there. No fear. Only calculation. A second figure stood beside her. Lydia Cole, 36, Vanessa's wife. Younger. Sharper. Silent in a way that felt dangerous. When Lydia smiled, it wasn't sympathy that lit her face. It was relief. Margaret felt the gentle squeeze again on the clear plastic tube. A question disguised as mercy. She remembered working overtime shifts for years, skipping holidays, pouring money into investments instead of vacations. She had built everything herself, nearly $1.9 million, saved and protected for security, not luxury. Vanessa leaned down, her perfume sickly sweet. "Rest, Mom," she whispered. "You won't remember any of this." But Margaret would remember everything. The heart monitor betrayed her. Its steady beeping quickened, exposing her awareness. Vanessa frowned. "She's reacting," she muttered. "Relax," Lydia replied softly. "It's just reflex." They turned toward the door, heels clicking against the linoleum like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. Margaret felt panic swell. But then something else happened. A soft digital chime echoed through the room.
Subtle.
Almost musical. Vanessa froze.
"What was that?" she asked.
Margaret knew the sound. She had memorized it years earlier. It was the internal security override, a silent alert tied directly to hospital systems and financial safeguards. A trap she had designed long before illness ever touched her body. 3 hours earlier, when the withdrawals began, the first alert had already gone out, not to the hospital, but to Eleanor Brooks, her closest friend of 32 years. Eleanor knew everything. The backup trustee clause. The automatic asset freeze. The legal dead switch embedded in Margaret's estate. Eleanor had not panicked. She had acted. And now the trap was closing. The door burst open with a force that made the walls tremble. A tall man stepped in first, Daniel Hale, 38, Margaret's son. His face was rigid with controlled fury. Behind him came 2 uniformed officers and a man in a gray suit holding a badge. "Financial Investigations Unit," the man said calmly. "We need to speak with Vanessa Hale and Lydia Cole regarding unauthorized transfers totaling $1.9 million. Vanessa's confidence collapsed instantly. Color drained from her face, as if fear had pulled it out. "This is a mistake," she stammered. Lydia said nothing. Her eyes searched the room for an exit that didn't exist. Daniel ignored them both. He went straight to his mother's bedside and took her hand gently. The moment he did, the monitor spiked, fast, steady, alive. "You're safe," he whispered. The officers began reading rights. Vanessa protested loudly. Lydia broke down, pointing fingers, crying that it had all been Vanessa's idea. Margaret lay still, listening, watching, fully awake. They had mistaken her silence for weakness. They were wrong. Eleanor arrived moments later, carrying a thick folder labeled in neat handwriting. She handed it to the investigator, without a word. Inside were transaction logs, forged signature comparisons, and emails Vanessa had exchanged with an offshore banker weeks earlier. One image stopped the room cold, a security still showing Vanessa and Lydia at a marble bank counter that very afternoon, laughing as they signed documents. Vanessa screamed betrayal when Lydia confessed. Lydia sobbed when the truth became undeniable. Daniel stood silent, unmoving. As they were escorted out, Margaret felt something unfamiliar settle over her. Not vengeance, not triumph, but certainty. She had spent decades building a fortress no one noticed. Legal safeguards, financial tripwires, witnesses who paid attention. Vanessa had tried to steal money. Instead, she had activated consequences. Margaret's eyes remained open as the room finally emptied. The machines hummed. The danger passed. This was not the end of her story. It was the moment the balance shifted. When the room finally emptied, the silence felt enormous. Machines hummed softly, indifferent witnesses to everything that had just unfolded. Eleanor Brooks remained by the door, her back turned toward where Vanessa and Lydia had been taken away. She refused to give them the dignity of a final glance. Margaret lay still, her body weak, but her mind razor-sharp. Eleanor approached the bed slowly. "You were right," she said quietly. The first transfer hit at 2:46 p.m. 3 separate shell accounts, each just under the federal reporting threshold. The system flagged it instantly. Margaret blinked once. That was enough. Words were unnecessary between them. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out another folder, thicker than the first. Inside was the master plan they had drafted 4 years earlier. Emergency protocols, legal contingencies, a financial dead switch. It had never been designed as revenge. It was armor. Margaret had prayed she would never need it. But prayer, she had learned long ago, was not a strategy. Preparation was. And now, preparation was the only reason she was still breathing. Daniel returned a few minutes later, holding a copy of the preliminary police report. "They're pressing charges tonight," he said, placing the papers carefully on the rolling tray.
Fraud.
Conspiracy. Attempted medical interference. All assets are frozen. His voice was steady, but his jaw trembled. "You're protected, Mom." Margaret watched him pull a chair close and sit the way he had when he was a boy, quiet, present, no need for words. He had spent years watching Vanessa belittle and manipulate her, always choosing peace over confrontation. Now, standing in the wreckage of her choices, he did not flinch. In the hallway, voices echoed. Phones rang. Somewhere down the corridor, Lydia's sobs rose, raw, desperate sounds stripped of performance. A nurse entered to check vitals. Her name badge read Nina. She hesitated before leaving. "I saw her hand on your oxygen line," she whispered. "I didn't know what else to do, so I triggered the silent alert." Margaret's fingers twitched weakly. Nina noticed and smiled softly. "You did the right thing," Daniel said firmly. Nina nodded once and slipped out. Left alone again, Margaret stared at the ceiling tiles, her thoughts clearer than they had been in years. They thought she was already gone. They thought silence meant surrender. Her life replayed in fragments, double shifts, unpaid sacrifices, private school tuition she could barely afford, the quiet swallowing of insults disguised as jokes. Vanessa's eye rolls. Her dismissive sighs. The slow erosion of respect. They hadn't just tried to steal her money. They had tried to erase her existence. Eleanor's loyalty. Daniel's strength. A nurse who refused to look away. Cameras. Documents. Systems layered one over another like stone walls. Daniel tucked the legal folders into the bedside drawer. "Rest," he said gently. But rest was impossible. A war had been declared in her hospital room, and it was already over. By the third day, the story was everywhere. Elderly investor targeted in family fraud scheme. The photo they used was old, Margaret and Daniel at a charity dinner years ago. The public outrage was swift and unforgiving. Vanessa's lawyer tried to frame it as a misunderstanding. Then the hospital released the hallway audio. Her voice ended the debate. She won't even feel it. The fallout came fast. Vanessa was fired from her senior role at the investment firm she had worked at for over a decade. Their statement was short and merciless. We uphold the highest ethical standards. Lydia was removed from every nonprofit board she served on. Unanimously. Quietly. But the real collapse happened behind closed doors. The protocol Margaret had designed did more than freeze accounts. It stripped Vanessa of power of attorney, healthcare proxy rights, and any legal authority tied to Margaret's life. They hadn't realized what they were stealing. Money had been the bait. Control was the trap. Investigators uncovered offshore accounts and falsified records tracing back months. This wasn't desperation. It was planning. Facing overwhelming evidence, Lydia accepted a plea deal. She testified fully, painting Vanessa as the architect. Vanessa refused her own deal.
Pride.
Delusion. She believed she could outthink the system. She had forgotten who taught her how to read balance sheets. Each morning, Daniel delivered updates. Each afternoon, Margaret withdrew further into silence, not weakness, but strength. Her silence no longer protected them. It protected her. Eleanor arrived one morning with a slender folder. It's finalized, she said. Inside were amended trust documents. Every asset transferred into a new irrevocable trust. Daniel named sole beneficiary. The reinstatement clause for Vanessa permanently voided. It wasn't revenge. It was surgery. The headlines faded. Life moved on. Margaret was discharged weeks later into a small sunlit bungalow with a wide porch and no echoes of old battles. She sold the family home. Peace mattered more than memory. The fortune that had nearly cost her life was redirected into a new purpose, the Hale Second Horizon Fund, providing legal protection and housing support for elderly victims of financial abuse. One afternoon, she sat in a community garden beside a woman helped by the fund. They spoke about flower boxes and fresh starts. Resilience, Margaret realized, wasn't loud. It was deliberate. Vanessa had tried to steal an inheritance. In doing so, she had revealed Margaret's true legacy. Margaret's final visitor before trial was Vanessa Hale. The court granted a supervised 10-minute visit, no more. When Vanessa entered the room, she no longer looked powerful. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by plain clothing that hung awkwardly on her thin frame. The confidence she once wore like armor had evaporated. She spoke quickly, words tumbling over one another. I was under pressure, she said. You don't understand how much stress I was under. Lydia pushed it. I thought you loved Daniel more anyway. Margaret listened without interruption. Silence filled the spaces Vanessa kept trying to patch with excuses. When she finally stopped, Margaret spoke, her voice rough but steady. You didn't try to take my money, she said. You tried to take my breath. Vanessa froze. You stood where you are now and decided my life was worth less than an account balance.
And you chose the money.
Vanessa's composure cracked. For the first time, fear, not anger, showed in her eyes. Margaret did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The truth was heavier than shouting. I don't hate you, Margaret continued. Hate requires energy. I no longer owe you. Vanessa's lips trembled. But I will not protect you from the consequences of your choices. You will face the law. You will face the public. And you will carry this alone. The words landed clean and final. This is the day you learn your mother survived you. Vanessa stood slowly, her chair scraping the floor. She did not argue. She did not apologize. She simply turned and left, escorted by an officer who closed the door behind her with quiet certainty. Margaret exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for decades. Minutes later, Daniel entered with a single notarized document. I need you to sign this, he said gently. It permanently barred Vanessa from any medical or legal authority over Margaret's life. Margaret signed without hesitation. It wasn't written in anger. It was written in clarity. When Daniel filed the document, he sat beside her, holding her hand until the machine slowed. There were no speeches. None were needed. The quiet after Margaret's discharge felt unreal. No alarms. No lawyers. No whispered threats. She settled into her new home, a modest bungalow with sunlight pouring through wide windows. She drank tea on the porch and learned the rhythm of peace. The Hale Second Horizon Fund expanded quickly. Legal aid. Emergency housing. Advocacy. Margaret refused publicity. She preferred results. One afternoon, she met Rosa Martinez, a 59-year-old woman whose son had drained her savings and tried to declare her incompetent. The fund paid for Rosa's attorney, secured her apartment, helped her start over. They sat together in a small garden behind the community center. "I'm planting marigolds," Rosa said. "They survive anything." Margaret smiled. They didn't talk about betrayal. They talked about soil, sunlight, and new beginnings. Margaret understood the difference now. Inheritance is what people fight over. Legacy is what changes lives. Vanessa had chased money. Margaret had built meaning. And meaning, she realized, could not be stolen. Occasionally, Margaret thought of Vanessa, not with rage, but with distance. Somewhere behind concrete walls and legal procedures, her daughter was learning what consequences felt like. Margaret felt sorrow, not regret. Vanessa had focused so intensely on the final chapter of her mother's life that she had never read the earlier ones. The chapters filled with endurance, preparation, and survival. Daniel visited often. They talked about ordinary things. Weather.
Books.
The slow rebuilding of trust where it had never broken. Margaret's strength no longer needed to be proven. It simply existed. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Margaret reflected on everything that had happened in that hospital room. The whispers, the threat, the moment of awakening. She had been underestimated, silenced, almost erased. But foresight had been her power. Boundaries had been her armor. And survival had been her final victory. Margaret sat on her porch as evening settled in, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The world felt wide again. If someone were listening, someone who had been dismissed, manipulated, or told their pain was inconvenient, Margaret hoped they would hear this. You are not powerless. Preparation is strength. Boundaries are self-respect. It is never too late to reclaim your life. Vanessa had tried to end her story early. Instead, Margaret rewrote it. She had built her fortress quietly, brick by brick, not to trap others, but to protect herself. And in the end, that protection did more than save her life. It transformed it. The trial moved faster than Margaret expected. Evidence does that, it leaves very little room for theater. The audio recordings from the ICU hallway played once in court, and that was enough. The jurors didn't look at Vanessa after that. They didn't need to. Margaret did not attend in person. She watched from home. The broadcast muted, Daniel seated beside her. She didn't need to hear the arguments again. She already knew the truth. When the verdict was read, Daniel reached for her hand. "It's over," he said quietly. Margaret nodded. Over did not mean healed. It meant closed. Vanessa was found guilty on multiple counts: financial fraud, conspiracy, attempted medical interference. Sentencing was scheduled for later, but the outcome was inevitable. Margaret felt no satisfaction, only a calm finality. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in years. No dreams, no vigilance, just rest. With the legal chapter closed, Margaret turned fully toward the future. She refined the mission of the Second Horizon Fund, insisting on safeguards she wished she'd had sooner: mandatory financial education, emergency reporting lines, independent oversight. Protection should never rely on trust alone, she told the board during the first meeting. Trust needs structure. Daniel watched her lead with quiet admiration. He had always known his mother was strong. Now, others were learning it too. Letters began to arrive. Not praise. Stories. Elderly parents. Isolated caregivers. People who had been told it was too late. Margaret read every one. She answered some herself. "You're not foolish," she wrote to one woman. "You are generous. There is a difference." Purpose, she discovered, was not loud. It was steady. Months later, Margaret received notice that Vanessa had requested a written statement from her for sentencing mitigation. Daniel brought the letter, but did not open it. "You don't owe her anything," he said. Margaret took the envelope anyway. She read it alone. There were apologies, explanations, familiar deflections dressed in new language. Margaret set the letter down. She wrote a response, but not the one Vanessa wanted. It was brief, clinical,
Honest.
"I acknowledge your request. I decline to intervene. Accountability is not cruelty." She mailed it the same day. Closure, she realized, was not reconciliation. It was release. Life settled into a gentle rhythm. Morning walks, afternoon reading, occasional visits to the foundation centers. Margaret no longer explained herself. She no longer softened her boundaries to keep others comfortable. Strength had taught her restraint, not silence. One afternoon, Daniel asked, "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I wish she had chosen differently," she said. "But I don't wish away who I became because of it." Daniel nodded. He understood. Some lessons arrive wrapped in loss. That does not make them worthless. On the anniversary of her hospitalization, Margaret returned briefly to the hospital, not as a patient, but as a donor. She met nurses, thanked administrators, found Nina, and took her hands. "You saved my life," Margaret said simply. Nina shook her head. "I just didn't look away." "That's how it starts," Margaret replied. As she left, Margaret felt light. Not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer controlled her. She had survived betrayal. She had reclaimed her voice. And she had built something that would outlive pain. Years later, Margaret rarely spoke about the trial. Not because it hurt, but because it no longer defined her. The story had moved beyond that hospital room, beyond the whisper and the hand on the oxygen line. People sometimes asked how she found the strength to survive it. Margaret never gave a dramatic answer. "I planned," she would say. Planning, she believed, was an act of self-respect. It was the quiet decision to matter, even when no one was watching. The Second Horizon Fund continued to grow, guided by strict transparency and accountability. Margaret insisted on systems that protected dignity as fiercely as finances. "You don't wait until harm happens," she told new staff. "You build barriers before someone thinks to cross them."
Her voice was calm.
Unapologetic. That calm, she knew, was her victory. Daniel married 2 years later in a small ceremony by the coast. Margaret watched from the front row, sunlight warming her shoulders, pride filling her chest. During the reception, Daniel leaned over and whispered, "I wouldn't be here without you." Margaret smiled. "You were always strong," she replied. "I just made sure the ground beneath you didn't collapse." Family, she learned, was not defined by blood alone. It was defined by loyalty, accountability, and care that did not demand silence in return. She danced once that night, slowly, carefully, joyfully. It was enough. Vanessa's sentence was delivered quietly. No cameras, no spectacle. Years of incarceration followed by restitution orders that would never fully be paid. Margaret did not attend. Justice, she understood, did not require her presence. What mattered was that the system held, that the law spoke when she could not. She felt sadness, but not guilt. You could love someone and still refuse to save them from themselves. That lesson had taken Margaret a lifetime to learn. Margaret spent her later years mentoring women who had been underestimated, widows, caregivers, immigrants, retirees. She never framed herself as a victim. "I was targeted," she said plainly. "And I responded." The distinction mattered. She taught them how to read financial statements, how to ask hard questions, how to trust their instincts without abandoning caution. Power, she told them, was not domination. It was preparedness. One evening, sitting alone on her porch, Margaret reflected on the difference between inheritance and legacy. Inheritance could be taken. Legacy could not. The foundation bore her name, but its strength came from the people it protected. Margaret watched the sky darken and felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. She had not survived to be remembered. She had survived to change outcomes. If her story reached someone sitting in silence, someone being dismissed, calculated, or erased, Margaret hoped they would understand this. Silence does not mean weakness. Preparation is power. Boundaries are love, directed inward. It is never too late to reclaim your life. Margaret Hale lived longer than anyone expected, and when her life finally ended, it did so on her terms, surrounded by peace, not fear. She had outlived betrayal. She had outbuilt cruelty. And she left behind something stronger than money. She left behind proof. You are the architect of your own fortress. Build it well. Thanks for watching.